Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal interesting facts on Wednesday, July 2nd, 2025. First, Sonny stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames that still danced violently in the wreckage of Charlie's bar. The heat from the fire seemed to scorch his very soul, and with every breath he took, he could feel his anger growing uncontrollably. Christina, his precious daughter, was lying in a hospital bed, her body burned beyond recognition. The sight of her fragile form haunted him as he tried to comprehend the pain that now threatened to tear his family apart. His heart shattered as the image of her suffering took over his thoughts, knowing he would never forgive whoever had done this to her. This wasn't just an accident, it was an act of vengeance, and Sonny wouldn't rest until he had avenged his child. The flames weren't the only thing that had burned in Port Charles that night. Sonny's heart had been ignited with a fury he hadn't known existed. First, Michael had been hurt, now Christina. It was too much, too fast, and the overwhelming anguish felt like it was suffocating him. The pain of watching his son suffer had nearly broken him, but now, seeing his daughter in a state of peril, was a weight he couldn't bear. It was a cruel twist of fate that the people he loved most were being hurt by the very monsters he had fought against all these years. Sonny could feel the searing rage building inside him, pushing him to the brink of madness. His mind was consumed with thoughts of retribution, the idea of paying back every ounce of pain they had caused his family. He didn't care about the law, the consequences, or the risk to his own life. This time, it wasn't just about him or his empire, it was about his children. The need to protect them, to make the perpetrators suffer the way they had made him suffer, was too strong to ignore. Sonny knew that he would stop at nothing to make those responsible pay. His promise for vengeance rang in his ears like a deafening drumbeat, the words echoing over and over, "They will regret this." Meanwhile, Sidwell watched from the shadows, relishing in Sonny's agony. He could barely contain his satisfaction as he reflected on the chaos he had set in motion. Every move Sonny made, every action he took, was playing directly into Sidwell's hands. While Sonny's family was being torn apart, Sidwell's plans were falling into place perfectly. The power he had amassed in the background was growing, and with every ripple of pain that spread through Sonny's life, Sidwell felt a twisted sense of victory. To him, Sonny was nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game, one that he had been orchestrating with precision and patience. Sidwell wasn't worried about the storm that Sonny would inevitably unleash. He knew Sonny's grief would make him reckless, and that was exactly what Sidwell wanted. As Sonny chased his own vendetta, Sidwell would be there, waiting for the moment when the walls closed in on him. The conflict between them was only just beginning, but Sidwell had already planned his next move. As Sonny continued to spiral into his rage, Sidwell's influence would grow, ensuring that in the end, he would come out victorious. What Sidwell had started was more than a simple attack. It was a meticulously calculated war, one where Sonny's fury would only serve to fuel his own rise to power. Second, Jocelyn paced nervously outside the small interrogation room, her mind racing with the memory of that fateful night. The image of the masked figure setting Charlie's bar ablaze was burned into her thoughts. She had been leaving the bar when she saw the person, their face hidden behind a dark mask, dousing the ground with gasoline before setting it on fire. The terrifying image replayed in her mind over and over, making it clear to her that she could no longer stay silent. This wasn't just another fire, it was personal, and she couldn't let it go without speaking up. She had to help, no matter the consequences. When Anna and Chase arrived, Jocelyn felt a rush of anxiety. She knew the importance of what she was about to reveal, and the weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. She had witnessed the fire, and now it was her responsibility to provide as much information as possible. As she recounted the night of the fire, she described everything she could remember, the masked figure's movements, the way the gasoline had poured out in streams, and how the flames had erupted. With each word, she could see Anna and Chase processing the information, taking notes, and exchanging looks of determination. Jocelyn could feel their commitment to solving this case, and she knew her statement could be the key to unraveling the mystery. As she spoke, Jocelyn couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. She had kept this secret for too long, unsure of what to do with the horrifying details. But now, with Anna and Chase listening intently, she felt like a burden was being lifted off her shoulders. She had seen something no one else had, and by giving them this crucial piece of evidence, she was doing her part to make sure the person responsible for the fire would be caught. Though she was nervous about the potential fallout, the sense of rightness in her actions pushed her forward. She wasn't just helping Sunny, she was helping the entire community. Anna's voice broke through her thoughts as she reassured her. "This could be the breakthrough we need," she said calmly, her demeanor steady but focused. Chase nodded, his face set in a serious expression. "We'll follow this lead all the way through," he assured Jocelyn, his voice filled with resolve. Jocelyn knew they were taking her words seriously, but there was still so much they needed to uncover. Who was behind the mask? What was their motive? These questions hung in the air, unanswered, but Jocelyn had given them the tool they needed to find the answers. As Jocelyn left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead would be anything but easy. Whoever had set that fire would stop at nothing to cover their tracks, and Sunny's quest for vengeance was only growing. But now, at least, there was a glimmer of hope. Her statement had given Anna and Chase the lead they needed to track down the person responsible. It wasn't much, but it was something. For now, Jocelyn could only wait, hoping that the truth would eventually come to light and justice would prevail. Third, Lucas sat in the dimly lit office, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the desk. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to unfold. His thoughts kept circling back to the hospital, to the growing chaos around Marco, and to the dark shadow that hung over his every move. Marco had always been intense, but lately, Lucas could sense a deeper, more dangerous rage in him. The recent death of Natalia, Marco's mother, had only added fuel to the fire. It wasn't just the tragedy of her death, it was the way she had died. The poisoning, the deliberate attack, had set Marco on a path of blind vengeance. Lucas knew Marco better than anyone, and he feared the worst. In the quiet of his office, Lucas couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of dread that had taken root inside him. Marco's grief and rage were clouding his judgment, and Lucas feared that his old friend would let his need for revenge consume him entirely. He had seen it before, people driven by anger could be reckless, and Marco was no exception. Lucas knew Marco would stop at nothing to get justice for his mother, even if it meant putting himself in grave danger. The thought of Marco's life spiraling out of control was enough to keep him awake at night, torn between his loyalty to his friend and his growing fear for his safety. Lucas tried to rationalize it, telling himself that he could intervene before things went too far. But deep down, he knew that Marco was already past the point of reason. The death of his mother had broken something inside him, and the idea of facing such an overwhelming loss had ignited a fire that Lucas wasn't sure could be extinguished. The more Marco delved into his pursuit of vengeance, the more Lucas saw the danger of his actions. Marco was so consumed by his need to right the wrongs done to Natalia that he had become blind to the consequences of his own actions. If he kept going down this path, there was no telling what would happen next. The hospital, too, had become a source of anxiety for Lucas. It wasn't just the pressure of the ongoing cases or the strain on the staff, it was the uncertainty of what might happen next. Marco's presence in the city had only added to the tension, and Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something dangerous was looming just around the corner. If Marco wasn't careful, his quest for revenge could pull him into a deadly game, one where the stakes were higher than he could have ever anticipated. Lucas knew that, for all his loyalty, he might not be able to save Marco from himself. In the end, Lucas's fear wasn't just for Marco's safety, it was for what Marco's actions might bring to everyone around him. The line between justice and destruction was thin, and Lucas wasn't sure Marco could tell the difference anymore. As the weight of the situation continued to bear down on him, Lucas could only hope that, somehow, Marco would find a way to stop before it was too late. But deep in his heart, Lucas feared that the course had already been set, and that nothing would stop Marco from seeking the vengeance he so desperately craved. Fourth, Tracy stood silently in the shadows, her mind whirling with calculated thoughts. She had always been the mastermind of manipulation in Port Charles, and her latest plan was no different. Drew had dared to cross her, to expose her use of ketamine to poison him, and now he was going to pay. She felt a bitter sting of betrayal as she thought back to the moment when Drew had turned the tables on her, using her own tactics against her. But Tracy wasn't one to back down, and now that she knew Drew and Willow were preparing to marry, it only made her resolve stronger. This wedding would not be a celebration, it would be Drew's downfall. As the details of the upcoming wedding surfaced, Tracy's mind raced with possibilities. The idea of Drew and Willow tying the knot had been a thorn in her side for some time. Drew had always been a threat to her ambitions, and the union between him and Willow was a powerful one that could shift the balance of power. Tracy couldn't allow that to happen. The thought of losing control, of being pushed aside in the wake of their happiness, enraged her. She needed to act, and fast. There was no room for mistakes, this had to be perfect. Tracy knew the wedding would be the perfect stage for her plan to unfold. The high-profile event, filled with emotions and public attention, would provide her with the ideal setting to strike at Drew. She had already started working behind the scenes, planting subtle doubts and creating situations that would make Drew's life unravel. She would exploit every weakness, every insecurity, and twist them into a trap he couldn't escape. The entire wedding would be her stage, and Drew would be the unwitting pawn in her game. Her plans, though intricate, were already in motion. Tracy had a way of weaving herself into the fabric of every event, unnoticed, until the moment came for her to strike. She had been preparing for this, making connections, planting whispers, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike when Drew's guard was down. The more she thought about it, the sweeter the revenge became. She wasn't just going to ruin Drew's wedding, she was going to make him regret ever trying to take her down. His downfall would be spectacular, and everyone would know who had orchestrated it. As the wedding day approached, Tracy felt a rush of anticipation. She knew this would be her finest work, a carefully crafted masterpiece of vengeance. Drew might have thought he had won, but he was about to learn that when it came to Tracy, no one crossed her without paying the price. The countdown had begun, and Tracy was ready to deliver the final blow. Nothing would stop her from making Drew regret ever crossing her path, and nothing, not even a wedding, would stand in the way of her ultimate revenge. Finally, Gio sat alone in the dimly lit room, the silence pressing against him like a physical weight. The air was thick with the tension he had carried for as long as he could remember, a tension that had become so familiar to him that he barely noticed it anymore. It had become a part of him, woven into his very being. He had spent so many years hiding behind a facade, a carefully constructed mask that hid the complexity of his thoughts and emotions. The world saw a confident, successful young man, a son, a friend, someone who had it all together. But beneath that surface, Gio was falling apart, and for the first time, he couldn't bear the weight of it anymore. His family's expectations had been a constant presence in his life. They had shaped him into the person he was, or at least, the person they wanted him to be. From the moment he was old enough to understand, he had been groomed for success, molded by the hands of those who believed they knew what was best for him. There was no room for mistakes, no space for vulnerability. Everything had to be perfect, every choice carefully calculated. But the pressure had been suffocating, and Gio had struggled in silence, feeling trapped in a life that didn't feel like his own. The facade was the only thing that kept him from being consumed by the fear that he would never be enough. For years, Gio had buried his emotions deep within himself, afraid to confront them. The guilt, the shame, the anger, it was all too much to face. Every failure, every mistake was another weight he piled on his shoulders, convincing himself that he deserved it. He had convinced himself that no one could ever understand the pain he carried, and so, he shut everyone out. He built walls so high around his heart that he couldn't even see over them anymore. It was easier that way. If he didn't let anyone in, if he didn't allow himself to feel anything too deeply, then he wouldn't have to face the truth of what he was really going through. But when he looked across at Emma, something shifted. There was a calmness in her presence, a quiet understanding that he hadn't expected. She had always been there, in the background of his life, but now, as their eyes met, Gio realized that she had seen something in him that no one else had. She saw past the walls he had built, past the mask he wore. For the first time in so long, he felt the urge to let go, to stop pretending. The thought terrified him, but at the same time, it was liberating. The weight of his emotions began to settle around him, and for the first time, he felt the crushing burden of everything he had been hiding. He had always been so focused on keeping up appearances, on doing what was expected of him, that he had lost sight of who he really was. His heart ached with the realization that he had spent so much time running from his own feelings, afraid that if he let them surface, they would destroy him. But Emma's steady gaze, her quiet presence, made him feel safe enough to stop running. He had never allowed himself to be vulnerable like this, never allowed anyone to see the broken parts of him. But in that moment, with Emma, he felt a shift, a tiny crack in the walls he had spent years building. Gio began to speak, but the words didn't come easily. They felt foreign on his tongue, as though he had forgotten how to speak his truth. But he pressed on, his voice barely above a whisper, as he started to unravel the tangled mess of emotions he had kept hidden for so long. He spoke of the constant pressure from his family, the expectations that weighed on him like chains, the fear that no matter how hard he tried, it would never be enough. He talked about the guilt that had plagued him for years, the mistakes he couldn't undo, the things he had done that haunted him in the quiet moments. It was hard, harder than anything he had ever done before, but it felt like a release. With every word, it was as though a little piece of the weight he had carried for so long was lifted off his shoulders. And then there was the fear, the deep, gnawing fear that had taken root in his soul. The fear that he wasn't good enough, that he would never live up to the image everyone had of him. The fear that if they knew the real Gio, they would abandon him, just as he had abandoned parts of himself. He had kept those parts hidden, locked away in the deepest corners of his mind, convinced that no one would ever accept him if they saw them. But as he spoke, as he let the words spill out, he began to understand that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry those fears anymore. Maybe Emma could see him, all of him, and still be there. Maybe, for the first time, he didn't have to be afraid. Emma didn't say anything at first, but Gio didn't need her to. The quiet support in her eyes was enough. She didn't judge him, didn't look at him with pity or confusion. She simply listened, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his emotions. As Gio finished speaking, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from his chest. It wasn't that everything was fixed, or that all of his problems had been solved, but in that moment, he felt like he had taken the first step toward healing. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone. With Emma's quiet support, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he could start to heal the broken parts of himself. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that it was possible to move forward, to let go of the past, and to embrace the future. As Gio sat there, the silence between him and Emma felt different now, comfortable, understanding. The walls he had spent years constructing around himself were beginning to crumble, piece by piece, and the weight he had carried for so long seemed lighter, less suffocating. He no longer felt as though he had to hide, to keep pretending to be someone he wasn't. The rawness of the emotions he had expressed to Emma, the vulnerability he had allowed himself to show, had opened up something inside him, a crack in his defenses, a willingness to be seen for who he truly was. For the first time in years, Gio didn't feel the constant pressure to be perfect. He didn't have to shoulder the burden of everyone else's expectations alone. Emma's quiet presence, her patience, had been a beacon of support that guided him through the darkest parts of himself. She hadn't tried to fix him, hadn't offered words of false comfort. Instead, she had simply listened, allowing him to unravel the knots of his heart at his own pace. And in that moment, Gio realized that he didn't need to carry the weight of the world on his own anymore. He had someone in his corner, someone who saw him, not the facade, not the image of who he was supposed to be, but the person beneath it all. Though the road ahead would not be easy, and the scars of his past would never fully disappear, Gio understood now that he didn't have to face them alone. He had taken the first step toward healing, toward acceptance. He could now begin to rebuild, piece by piece, without the fear of being exposed or rejected. With Emma's steady presence and the quiet strength she had offered him, Gio felt a glimmer of hope that he could begin to move forward, leaving behind the weight of past mistakes, guilt, and expectations. There was still so much work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the possibility of a new beginning.